ongoing discussions over whether one can find discernible language on the pews at First African Baptist Church, a question may arise. Why aren't individual words sufficient? That is to say, why is the challenge to find a coherent phrase or sentence? Why wouldn't a single word be sufficient for demonstrating Hebrew on the pews? Now, I touched on this issue a bit in my first video on this topic back in October of 2019, but I'd like to address the issue here in a bit more detail. The reason a single word would not be sufficient is because it is too easy to arrive at a false positive. There are all sorts of things that are not Hebrew, yet which look like Hebrew characters or even Hebrew words, and I'd like to share a few examples of such in this video. For my first analogy in this regard, let's assume someone was writing down a phone number with Manhattan's primary area code. So here I'm going to write with deliberately sloppy handwriting, 212-777-3456, which a quarter century ago was the Manhattan number for movie phone. If we zoom in on that 212 area code, we might notice that in this style of handwriting, it looks like a cursive Hebrew dalet wa dalet, which is how you spell the name David. And it's also the word for beloved and now uncle. For example, for those of you who have seen my videos on Song of Songs 5:16, when that verse declares Ze Dodi, this is my beloved, it is using that word, dalet wa dalet, dod, with a first person singular possessive suffix. The point of the analogy should be obvious. Although this looks like a Hebrew word, it's not a Hebrew word. It's simply Manhattan's primary area code. But it's possible for the mind to associate it with a Hebrew word, even when it's not. But let's consider another example. Suppose someone was scribbling on a piece of paper and they made this mark before being interrupted from whatever it was that they were doing. What is that mark? What is that word that we're looking at? Might it be sus, the Hebrew word for horse, written in cursive characters? Is that possible? It certainly looks like the word sus written in cursive, but was that intended by the person who made the mark? Maybe it was intended as a percent sign, but one written with like a shaky or sloppy hand. Or, if we really want to get silly, maybe the person was in the process of doodling a face and started with the eyes and nose before getting interrupted. Again, the point is that you can have something which looks like a Hebrew word, yet it's not actually a Hebrew word. However, I would guess that some might not like this particular example or find it particularly persuasive, so let me try some other examples, which might be a bit more relevant to recent conversations and to the subject that inspired this video. Let's do a little test with Google Images. I'm going to do a search for the words medullary, raise, oak. Now, before I get into this, I want to slip in a couple of quick disclaimers. First, or the first disclaimer, although I pronounce the word medullary, I'm well aware that many others pronounce it medullary. If you feel I'm mispronouncing it, if you prefer to pronounce it medullary, if you feel that's the correct pronunciation, fine. I ask that you forgive me, but some of you might have had a brief section on dendrology or even botany in general back when you took undergrad biology or earth sciences or whatever, and you may have heard the word pronounced medullary or something along those lines. Whatever the case. Second disclaimer, although I am exploring here medullary, raise, and wood, I am not positively asserting that the markings on the pews in Savannah are necessarily medullary raise. I think that's at least possible, but as I've never examined those boards, I have no way of knowing for certain, and thus I fully acknowledge that they could well not be medullary raise. I fully acknowledge that. Whatever the case, those disclaimers out of the way, let's get right into the results that came up. I want to begin with this second image, the one in the middle of the top row. As we zoom in on this particular piece of wood, I would propose that among those naturally occurring medullary rays, we can find a portion that looks a bit like a cursive yod yod nun, which is the word for wine in Hebrew, yayin. And because these are simple straight lines, you can honestly find things that look like the Hebrew word yayin, at least in the cursive script, in a variety of places. And the reason why the cursive is relevant is because it's less ornate than like a standard Ashuri script. But whatever, despite the fact that this looks like a Hebrew word, it's just random, naturally occurring cellular structures. Okay, putting that aside, let's consider an even more dramatic example. So returning to our search results, I'd like to now look at that third hit at the top right. Zooming in on this piece of wood, I'd like to focus on this portion right here. I would propose that this portion looks like the Hebrew characters lamed yod yod. Admittedly, that's more of a standard square or ashuri lamed than a cursive lamed, but still, this portion looks like it reads lamed yod yod. However, is that a Hebrew word? I would propose that if you want to go the Sephardi route on this, because as some have done that, if you want to go to the Sephardi route on this, one might propose that it's actually a Ladino word, which is to say a Spanish word written in Hebrew characters. In Ladino, this is how you spell ley, the word for law, and a creative mind can then build imaginative possibilities around that fact. For example, I'd like to turn to this old Ladino Passover Haggadah, available on HebrewBooks.org, and I'll share a link in the video description. This work contains readings which various Ladino-speaking Jews would go over on the night of Passover. So I'm going to scroll down to the 33rd page of the PDF and look at this portion right here at the bottom of this page. It reads as follows. Si Mos allegaba delante monte de Sinai, y non daba a nos a la ley, abastaba a nos, which means if we were brought near Mount Sinai and the law was not given to us, it would have been enough for us. And notice the reference to the Torah is via that Ladino word, ley, spelled lamed yod yod. And then at the top of the next page, the same word appears again, when in the very next line, it's stated, si daba a nos a la ley, y non nos hacía entrar a tierra de Israel, abastaba a nos. If the law was given to us and we were not enabled to enter the land of Israel, it would have been enough for us. And aside from that, in this same Haggadah, there's actually another use of the string of characters lamed yod yod, but as a Hebrew construction rather than as a Ladino word. To show that, I'm going to scroll down to the 48th page of the PDF. And on this page, the work quotes the 136th Psalm. And in the Hebrew text, when the opening verse of that psalm commands the people to give thanks to the Lord, the tetragrammaton appears. However, as this work is not going to employ the tetragrammaton, it instead employs a double yod, where the tetragrammaton appears in the biblical text. As was mentioned in the previous videos, some rabbinic works use the double yod as a reference to the tetragrammaton, and here we see an example of that phenomenon. But in this case, there's a lamed prefixed to the double yod as a preposition, to the Lord. As a result, we have a sensible use of the string of characters lamed yod yod in Hebrew, meaning, as I said, to the Lord, to Yah, La Ladonai, however you want to pronounce it. Now, having looked at all that, a sleight of mind can occur here. Imagine someone declaring that the second piece of wood we looked at, we found a reference to the Lord, as if the Lord was winking at us and saying, "Here I am, you have found me." And we also found a reference to the law, a Sephardic Jewish reference to the Torah. But alas, no, none of that is actually in the relevant pattern on the piece of wood we looked at. While a portion looks like a string of Hebrew characters, it's not actually Hebrew, or Ladino for that matter. Rather, these are just naturally occurring cellular growths. So, jumping back into our Google image search, I'd like to look at just one last piece of wood as one last example. I'd like to look at these two boards on the right. So I'll zoom in, and then I want to rotate the image 270 degrees like this. And now I'd like to zoom in on that top board. Looking at this board and recalling that some had tried to find resemblances to specifically the Solitreo script, I would propose that these markings resemble 3 Wa's and then Wa Yod Dalet. And again, I'm saying it looks like specifically a Solitreo Dalet. Not a Dalet in other forms of cursive, and definitely not an Ashuri Dalet, a Solitreo Dalet. Here too, if one's mind is creative enough, they can build an elaborate and imaginative narrative around these markings to make sense of them, like a sort of dendrological midrash. So, having a little fun, let's suppose that the first wa in each alleged string of characters is a conjunction, a prefixed wa. So if we're going to ignore those purported conjunctions, then the first word would be spelled wa, forming the word wow, which means peg or pin or hook. And perhaps it's worth noting that even when it refers to a hook, it's still referring to an object which is driven or sort of drilled into a vertical surface, and then people hang things from the portion that protrudes outward, which is, say, the portion that's still sticking out. And then the second word, again, if we ignore what is allegedly a prefix wa, would be yod dalet, spelling yad, the Hebrew word for hand. Regarding that first word, wow, some like to interpret it as meaning nail. Now, if you have a problem with that, okay, but just for the sake of the thought experiment, I would ask that we run with that. And imagine the person working with this wood was himself a carpenter, and thus, as a carpenter, he felt a special kinship with Christ, or at least the family of Christ. Perhaps that hypothetical carpenter wrote these supposed words as part of a meditation on elements from the Passion. Maybe this was a small portion of a longer litany of related things. Perhaps this portion read, and a nail, and a hand. And you get the point. The mind is able to build elaborate conceptual structures to attempt to shed light on very small bits of data. Sometimes a healthy dose of creative imagination is mixed in. In this last example, one might take some, like mere medullary rays and turn them into an allusion to the crucifixion. That's the power of the creative mind. But it doesn't necessarily reflect reality. And this takes us back to the central question of this video. Why is the challenge to find a coherent phrase or coherent sentences? Why are simply individual words insufficient? The answer is because an approach which only looks for individual words is far too susceptible to false positives. It is far too easy to find a variety of things and interpret them as Hebrew words when they really aren't. Perhaps that's possible with sentences as well, but surely it would be much more difficult. On that note, as always, I look forward to the comments of others. I hope everyone found, or at least some, found these thought experiments helpful. God bless.